Good evening, everyone, and welcome back on this beautiful night here in Brooklyn and wherever you are around the world. Thank you for coming back. I just want to repeat this announcement, and sometimes the people who are here don't need to hear it, and it's the other people. But in case you are new or you haven't heard it, every one of Tom's presentations, as are all the presentations for Spirit of Life, are recorded. So you don't have to write and ask, can I see this? I wasn't able to make it. It's recorded, all right? And it'll take about maybe 48 to 72 hours for Matthew, our tech support, to get it edited and put up. But it's always there. And if you miss anything, you can always go back to it, or if you'd like to hear it again. So welcome back, everyone. And Tom, we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say about the sisters tonight. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. For tonight, our third session, I'd like to focus on the era of brick and mortar Catholicism, turning attention to the remarkable institutional growth that came to define US Catholicism from the second half of the 19th century on through the early 20th century. This is one of the topics that first got me interested in US Catholic history. I was amazed at the way that Catholicism left its imprint on the physical landscape, not just with churches, but schools, hospitals, orphanages, and other impressive institutions. A few years ago, I spent several weeks reading through the Catholic newspapers from the Archdiocese of Philadelphia from 1900 through 1930. And I was struck at how almost every issue seemed to call attention to a building project, either one that was getting started or one that was recently completed. And I thumbed through architectural guides. This was an architectural album prepared by E.F. Durang, who was one of the leading church architects in Philadelphia during the late 19th and early 20th century. And he put together this album basically showcasing all of the structures that he was responsible for in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, including the upper image is a hospital, the one to the right is Roman Catholic High School, and the lower one is just sort of a parish in West Philadelphia. I was also struck at this ad, which comes from kind of the end of this brick and mortar era. But this was a sort of an image from the newspaper from 1930, and it celebrated the opening of St. Barbara's new school. But what I found really interesting is that included all of the other companies that helped contribute to the building of that school, the companies, the contractors, whether it's the American Radiator Company, it's a stonemason, it's a bricklayer, it's the person who provided the pews, the electricians. There was an entire economy surrounding these projects. So tonight I just want us to think about how and why this institutional network developed. How was it sustained? How was it managed? And how did it shape and structure American Catholic life? And what was its legacy? Part of this is rooted in nativism. As commonly told, Catholic institutional development was in part a response to the religious hostility that Catholics encountered in the United States. Since the colonial era, the nation was awash in anti-Catholic animus. It only grew as the Catholic population increased over the course of the 19th century. And for those of you who tuned in last week, we talked about the immigrant church. I don't think I need to rehearse all of this, but this anti-Catholic sentiment was ever present. It was built on the idea that Catholicism was incompatible with American democracy, and that Catholics could not be loyal citizens of the Republic. During the mid-19th century, these concerns were fueled by abundant anti-Catholic literature. One of the most famous accounts was the story of Maria Monk, a fictitious tale of her life in the convent and eventual escape. It was a bestseller of its day, captivating readers with lurid tales of sexual deviance and religious corruption. It warned other innocent girls of the dangers of the convent and of Catholicism. Though entirely made up, countless readers believed the story to be true. It prompted several states to establish nunnery commissions and pass convent inspection laws. Some states would enact similar measures in the early 20th century because these convent narratives continue to circulate and new ones appear. There was one that came out in 1924 called Behind Convent Walls. In these anti-Catholic tracts, the Jesuits stood out for particular attention. And so here is just a sampling of some of these texts with the dangers of Jesuit instruction. 40 popish frauds detected and disclosed. So here you just get you could find any number of these. And all of these texts and tales led to violence itself. One of the first and most stunning incidents of anti-Catholicism came in 1834 with the burning of the Ursuline convent in Charleston, just outside of Boston, and that's the image that you have to the left. There, the French-trained Irish Ursuline nuns conducted a prestigious convent school, which attracted students from the city's elite who wanted their daughters to receive a refined continental European education. But rumors swirled that women were being held against their will, and several of the sisters were converts to Catholicism, and so there are questions about whether they had done so willingly. Inspectors were called in to investigate. Though they reported nothing irregular, mobs soon gathered and began throwing stones at the convent. They later broke in and torched the place. Thankfully, the sisters and the students were able to escape. Another incident occurred in Philadelphia with the famous nativist riots of 1844. Violence erupted that May when nativists held a rally in a predominantly Irish Catholic neighborhood north of the city. Shots were fired and havoc broke loose. Violence continued in the days ahead. Among the targets of the nativists were the city's Catholic churches, two of which were burned to the ground, St. Michael's and St. Augustine. The local militia struggled to contain the violence, which stretched on for weeks. In New York, Bishop John Hughes organized men to defend the city's Catholic churches and warned mobs that if any of the churches were touched, it would turn New York City into a, quote, second Moscow. It was a reference to Napoleon's scorched earth destruction of that city. The memory of violence and anti-Catholic animus would live on. One oft-told tale in Philadelphia, and this is a bit of Catholic lore, was the design of the new Catholic cathedral, which was built in the 1850s, kind of in the aftermath of these riots. The story goes that the architect placed the cathedral windows up high so that they were above where a stone thrower could reach. So because supposedly the architect went out there and started chucking stones to see how high the windows needed to be. But all of this violence became a recurring explanation for why Catholics needed to build their own protective institutions. Over the course of the 19th century, Catholics built up an impressive institutional presence. The parish became the center of Catholic life, both religious and social. But having a church was not enough. In 1884, the US bishops declared that every parish with the financial means to do so should establish a school. While the goal was never met, it set out an ambitious target. And it wasn't just grade schools. It then became high schools, colleges and universities, hospitals, sports leagues, professional associations, and so much more. The Catholic world was all-encompassing. And of course, other religious communities did the same in building up their own institutions, but none matched the Catholics in the extent of the enterprise. The late 19th and early 20th century came to be known as the era of brick and mortar Catholicism. Success was measured in terms of buildings. During this era, priests like Father Morris Dorney were typical. Born in Springfield, Massachusetts, his family had moved to Chicago, where he was later ordained in 1874. In 1880, he was named the founding pastor of St. Gabriel's to serve the Irish community living and working near the city's stockyards. The cornerstone for the church was laid in 1887, and the Romanesque structure was designed by the prominent Chicago architects Burnham and Root. The church building was dedicated the following year. Its 16-story tower dominated the local skyline. Priests of Dorney's generations earned accolades for their ability to build and manage the parishes assigned to them. Dorney himself was known as the King of the Yards. His authority extended beyond the parish into the neighborhood. He was known to walk through the district like a cop on the beat. He solved labor disputes, helped parishioners find employment, and worked closely with local politicians to ensure that community needs were met. He also promoted temperance and led a crusade against the saloons that preyed upon his parishioners. He led the parish for 35 years until his death in 1914. And Dorney was not alone. As historian John McGreevy writes in his now classic book, Parish Boundaries, these dense social networks centered themselves around an institutional structure of enormous magnitude. Virtually every parish in northern cities included a church, a parochial school, a convent, a rectory, and occasionally gyms, auditoriums, and other structures. In Brooklyn, by 1940, there were 129 parishes and more than 100 elementary schools. This map is a little bit earlier on, but it gives you an extent of the density of these Catholic parishes and all the other institutions that surrounded them. These parishes sponsored a range of organizations and activities: religious sodalities, mothers' clubs, youth groups, athletic teams, choirs and music societies, charitable associations, and fraternal organizations. In 1896, the Bulletin of Holy Family Parish in Chicago listed at least 25 societies and groups. And here I like to think about how the Catholic parish of this era was very much an American invention. As much as we think about European Catholicism being a European transplant, these parishes that developed really grew out of kind of American circumstances, and this idea that the Catholic parish needed to be this tremendous plant beyond just the church itself was something that was born out of American conditions. So here, a parish like Transfiguration of Our Lord in West Philadelphia really sort of stood out in the local landscape of row houses. It took up an entire city block and really had kind of an outsized presence in the community. One of the things that always bothered me was the assertion that Catholic parishes were paid for by the nickels and dimes of immigrants. While there's certainly truth to that, parish finance was much more complex and sophisticated than the nickel and dime story suggests, especially by the early 20th century. The basic problem was that the nickel and dime approach could easily take decades, and church leaders were not willing to wait that long, especially those who built their reputation on their building programs and who measured success in terms of institutional growth. In Philadelphia, Cardinal Dennis Doherty was nicknamed God's bricklayer, which reflected that mentality. As a result, church leaders developed new strategies to mobilize resources during this period of parochial expansion, as the rate of growth and the scale of parochial projects increased dramatically, especially in urban neighborhoods. And these neighborhoods, like Transfiguration, these aren't the city's immigrant neighborhoods. These are now sort of the second and third generation sort of Irish Catholics, sort of the children and grandchildren of the famine generation. I was particularly struck by the use of modern fundraising activities and techniques during the 1910s and the 1920s. When I dug into the Philadelphia archives, I stumbled upon the work of a Daniel B. O'Loughlin, a former salesman who became, quote, adept at the work of systematizing. He crisscrossed the Archdiocese of Philadelphia during the 1910s and 20s, running parish capital campaigns. Much of his work was captured in his promotional newsletter, the O'Loughlin Parish Campaign Catechism. And as the name suggests, his catechism was structured in a question and answer format reminiscent of the Baltimore Catechism. He encouraged pastors that rather than relying on fundraising fairs and dinners, they should turn to organized drives. He trained members of the parish to canvass the parish neighborhood to secure pledges. He modeled the effort after World War I Liberty Loan drives. In some of his campaigns, he was able to secure as much as $50,000 to $100,000 in pledges for a parish within 6 to 8 short weeks. Prior, pastors were often cautious, not breaking ground until they had actual funds on hand. O'Loughlin, however, knew that it was important to start the projects in order to generate interest and commitment. His career demonstrates how Catholics became much more adept and savvy in their fundraising efforts and financial operations. It was a change from the earlier brick and mortar era of the 1870s and 1880s, which were characterized by incremental growth and a more piecemeal planning. You might build the parish and then hope to build the school and hope to build the rectory. Here, the goal was to have the entire parish plant completed within sort of a decade or less. At the dedication of the Church of the Transfiguration in West Philadelphia, the parish that I just showed you, the church was dedicated in 1928. At that time, Cardinal Dennis Doherty called attention to the parish's rapid completion. Quote, "Most of the parishes in the diocese have required a long stretch of years for the complete erection of needed parochial buildings, but the parish of Transfiguration has completed the entire group in 1 generation, in its case, 13 years. And so this parish growth really reflected sort of a new organizational imperative on the part of church leaders. And cardinals bishops like Cardinal Doherty also played an important role. He and sort of other bishops of his generation often kept ahead of home building, buying up land in areas slated for development, tracking the streetcar lines or the trolley lines as they developed. One parish in South Philadelphia stood amid, quote, vacant lots, brick ponds, and dust heaps, several blocks away of the limits of the built-up city. But that's where they decided to plant the parish, knowing that the community would develop around it. The bishops also invested parish funds in diocesan accounts, which they could then be used to provide capital for new projects, basically providing sort of a revolving sort of capital fund for the entire diocese. Real estate and finance operations became much more sophisticated as dioceses took the lead in planning and coordinating expansion. Some have argued that these brick and mortar networks held Catholics back, that they fostered a ghetto mentality and hindered Catholic assimilation into the American mainstream. Nativist critics certainly pounced on that idea. How would these immigrant Catholics ever become American if they kept to their own Catholic institutional world? But history also reveals how these institutions and the Catholic subculture that they fostered became a means for social engagement. Groups like the Holy Name Society, which claimed more than 1,800 branches by 1917, sought to cultivate religious devotion among its members. But it also became a powerful tool for organizing and mobilizing Catholics on social issues. And the upper image is a photo of a Holy Name Society march in Washington, D.C. Women and youth had their own associations, which taught them organization and leadership skills that transferred over into other areas of life. These parish groups were the precursor to the development of an even more robust Catholic action of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. Catholic action, defined as the participation of the laity in the apostolate of the hierarchy, saw the development of all sorts of Catholic groups and organizations to bring Catholic influence to bear on society. And so these included Catholic labor schools and the Association of Catholic Trade Unionists, the National Council of Catholic Women, which was organized in the wake of the passage of the 19th Amendment, the National Catholic Rural Life Conference, the Catholic Youth Organization, Catholic Student Mission Crusade, the Christian Family Movement, and also professional groups like the Catholic Medical Association, Catholic Nurses Guild, Catholic Press Association, and the American Catholic Historical Association. All of them trace their origins to the 1910s and 1920s. And all of them relied on the institutional networks of the brick and mortar era. Looking beyond the parish, we have to recognize the contributions of women religious as institution builders in their own right. By 1920, Catholic sisters had created and maintained some 500 hospitals, 50 women's colleges, and staffed more than 6,000 parochial schools, serving 1.7 million students. That doesn't include the academies, orphanages, homes, and other institutions that they operated. Priests may have controlled the parish, but women religious staffed and directed many of the other institutions that were part of this Catholic world. Mothers Superior were essentially CEOs of Catholic charitable networks. And Catholic sisters were often pioneers, bringing the church's presence into communities as the nation expanded. One remarkable figure was Mother Joseph Parasol, and she's the one shown here. She was a member of the Sisters of Providence from Montreal. She was born in 1823, the third of 12 children. Her father was a skilled coachmaker, and she learned carpentry and design skills from him. She joined the sisters at age 20. As a novice, she was trained in nursing, but also assisted the treasurer with the order's accounts. In 1856, she led a group of 4 sisters from Montreal to Washington Territory. When they arrived after a month's journey, they discovered that no preparation had been made for their accommodations, much like Mother Cabrini's experience that we talked about last time. But that didn't deter them. They quickly set out to establish a school and a hospital, the first in the Pacific Northwest. Mother Joseph was an energetic and enterprising builder. She traveled by train, ship, and horseback throughout mining towns in Idaho, Montana, and Oregon, on begging tours, seeking out donations of money or gold dust. She also took a direct role in overseeing the sisters' various construction projects, checking the design and inspecting the work herself. Providence Academy in Vancouver, Washington, built in 1873, was one of her finest projects. She died in 1902, but only after leading her community for nearly 50 years. They built up an extensive network of schools and hospitals, many of which are still in operation today. And in 1980, a statue of her was added to Statuary Hall in the U.S. Capitol building. She was chosen as one of 2 figures to represent the state of Washington, a tribute to her immense work in education and social welfare. Other communities of women religious were equally pioneering. The Sisters of Loretto from Kentucky went to Colorado and the American Southwest. The Sisters of St. Joseph expanded rapidly following their arrival in the United States in St. Louis in 1836, sending sisters to Philadelphia, Rochester, Buffalo, Brooklyn, St. Paul, and elsewhere. Sisters of Mercy did likewise following their arrival in Pittsburgh from Ireland in 1848. Mother Frances Ward, their leader, established 82 Mercy convents, schools, hospitals, and other works in some 20 cities across 9 states by the time of her death in 1884. As these religious communities developed, religious life offered women opportunity for education, leadership, and professional careers. I think of someone like Catherine Drexel, the foundress of the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament, and now a recognized Catholic saint. She used the money she inherited from her father to fund the work of her religious order, establishing missions and schools to serve Blacks and Indians, including Xavier University in New Orleans, the only historically Black Catholic institution of higher education in the United States. She was the daughter of a banker, but careers in that field were closed to her as a woman, even though she exhibited tremendous financial acumen. Religious life provided her with an opportunity not only to live out her vocation, but as a means and an outlet to employ her talents. She managed her missions like the best corporate executive of her day, demanding financial accountability down to the last cent from those she funded. She was the daughter of a banker. And this led to a sort of a great deal of consternation from some missionary priests who were not accustomed to having to account for how they spent their money to a woman, let alone a sister. Though Catherine Drexel was perhaps exceptional because of her fortune, she represents countless other women religious who use their talents, whether individually or collectively, to expand the church's institutional presence and carry out its mission. My own area of research for the past several years has been Catholic healthcare, focusing on the history of St. Vincent's Hospital in New York City. Founded in 1849 by 5 Sisters of Charity, it became, by 1960, the largest Catholic and largest church-affiliated hospital of any denomination in the United States. How'd they do it? Scholars of Catholic healthcare have rightly called attention to sisters' contributions to nursing, most prominently during the Civil War, when Catholic sisters provided 20% of nursing on both sides of the conflict. They were among the few women prior to the Civil War with any formal training in nursing. They then continued that work in Catholic hospitals. They also took the lead in nursing education, with hundreds of hospital schools of nursing across the country by the mid-20th century. As important as their contributions to nursing were, I'm perhaps more impressed by the role of sisters as pioneers in hospital administration. Catholic sisters stood out because they owned and managed the hospitals they founded. That was a rarity for women. Most other hospitals were owned and managed either by male doctors or male trustees. But ownership enabled the sisters to set institutional policies and values. They set terms of admission, for instance, turning no one away, regardless of race, creed, or ability to pay. In that way, they not only built hospitals, but expanded healthcare access. In today's terms, this was women's healthcare activism, which they were able to do because they controlled the institution. They were exceptional. When hospital management emerged as a professional field in the early 20th century, one of the leaders of the movement, Dr. S.S. Goldwater, the head of New York's Mount Sinai Hospital, argued that healthcare in the country would be greatly enhanced, quote, through training of virile men in the theory and practice of medical administration. These words from 1919 indicate how he considered hospital administration to be a necessarily male profession, one that combined the competencies found in 2 other male-dominated spheres, medicine and business. He couldn't imagine women filling that role, even though many Catholic sisters had been doing exactly that for more than half a century. And when the Rockefeller Foundation sponsored a conference on the training of hospital administrators in 1920, among those in attendance at the New York gathering were several sisters of charity, who stood out amid the crowd, not only because of their sex, but because of their religious garb. And I can only imagine sort of a room full of sort of medical doctors in their white coats, and here were these sisters of charity in their black habits and black bonnets mixed in with that crowd. And so that sort of shows us that Catholic sisters did not so much push their way into a field closed to them, as much as they worked to maintain their established presence in a field that they had helped pioneer. The Sisters of Charity in New York managed a healthcare network that included not only a general hospital like St. Vincent's, but also old age homes, specialized care facilities for those suffering from tuberculosis, asylums for the insane, and rest homes for children. Their network was vast. They were skilled in healthcare administration and management. Among those specialized care facilities that they established, one that deserves particular attention is the New York Foundling, an institution dedicated to the care of abandoned infants. The project was born of the vision of Sister Mary Irene Fitzgibbons, who had entered the Sisters of Charity in 1850 and was initially assigned to teach. Moved by concern for the city's ever-increasing number of children whose parents lacked the resources to provide for them, she dedicated herself to their care. And the hospital cared not only for true orphans, those who had lost their parents, but also children who were turned over to the hospital for temporary custody. The goal was always for family reunification. And the image on your right is one of the sisters in front of the bassinet, and kind of what the Foundling did when it was first founded is basically had a basket where parents in sort of desperation could leave their child into the care of the Foundling. With the permission of the Mother Superior and only $5 in hand, Sister Mary Irene and 3 other sisters secured a rented townhouse on East 12th Street in October 1869 and began their new ministry. Within a year, they had accepted some 2,500 babies and moved into a larger home. In 1870, the state legislature authorized the city to provide the sisters with a block of land on 3rd Avenue and 68th Street and a $100,000 appropriation to support the construction of a permanent facility, which opened in 1873. By the 1890s, the Foundling housed an average of 600 women and 1,800 children at a time. It provided daycare for working mothers, a maternity hospital for poor women, a children's hospital, and a shelter for unwed mothers. It had an annual budget of $250,000 paid for by city taxes. The special case was the result of the close ties between the Catholic Church and Tammany Hall, New York City's political machine, but also the product of a prolonged Catholic struggle to ensure that the religious rights of children were protected. In 1875, Catholics celebrated the passage of the Children's Law of New York, which stipulated that placement agencies must respect the religion of the child and, whenever possible, place them with a family or institution of the same faith. So a Catholic infant should be placed in a Catholic home, a Jewish infant should be placed in a Jewish home, and so on. The law, supported by tax dollars, spurred the expansion of the Catholic childcare system. In this regard, Catholics, and Catholic sisters in particular, played a crucial role in the creation of New York's welfare system, as historian Maureen Fitzgerald has ably demonstrated in her book, Habits of Compassion. Typical historical narratives have overlooked or erased the contributions of women religious to the history of the welfare system. And here I should note, it's not just about charity. Through their work, the sisters gained a great deal of information and insight about the everyday experiences of the poor and the circumstances that drove women to abandon their children or even infanticide. The work gave sisters a new understanding of the challenges faced by those in need, especially women. And the sisters were mindful, as a result, to avoid shaming women or faulting them for their situation. Sister Mary Irene admonished her fellow sisters at the Foundling to, quote, live to be trusted. And it wasn't just childcare but family welfare. The sisters at the founding hired women to serve as wet nurses for the abandoned infants under their charge. This allowed those women to earn wages while caring for their own children as well as another. And here, the sisters did not discriminate on racial, ethnic, or class lines, only insisting that those they hired were, quote, good mothers. They refused to punish women for their passion or their poverty. And as Fitzgerald's study suggests, institutions gave witness to Catholic values and gave sisters a platform to affect social policies. Institutions were a springboard for action because it gave them a firsthand account of what communities needed. And when I look at the history of St. Vincent's Hospital, I see remarkable parallels. Over the course of the hospital's history, the sisters at St. Vincent's pushed the city to take responsibility for compensating the hospital for the care of those who were considered the city's own public charges, basically forcing the city to pay up for its own welfare responsibilities. During the 1960s, the sisters worked to enroll eligible patients in Medicare and Medicaid. They fought to get Medicare compensation for those doctors and nurses who made house calls to the homebound elderly. When the hospital established its initial program, Medicare law refused to allow hospitals to submit for reimbursement, even though individual doctors who might do house calls could. And so the actions of St. Vincent's Hospital actually led to national Medicare reform. Later on, during the AIDS crisis, St. Vincent's Hospital fought to get health insurance providers to recognize in-hospital hospice care for the dying, something that was supposed to take place in the home. So originally, insurers said, no, hospice is only for homebound care, but AIDS patients were too weak to transfer into the homes. So the hospital itself fought to get the insurers to cover that in-hospital hospice care. In other places, sisters like Sister Mary Ignatia, a sister of charity of St. Augustine working in Akron, Ohio, pushed for alcoholism to be treated as a medical condition. Sisters in the Jim Crow South served both Black and whites, something that few institutions would. And I'm sorry, I should say that sisters in the Jim Crow South who established hospitals served both Blacks and whites. They were some of the few institutions to do so. Sisters broke the color line in education as well. The Sisters of St. Joseph in St. Augustine, Florida, ran integrated schools in the early 20th century and even went to court to protect the work when the state tried to ban them. All of these things show how sisters were effective advocates because they witnessed need firsthand, and they were able to break barriers because they ran, owned, and controlled these institutions, whether schools or hospitals. Switching gears slightly, I should note that all of this institutional growth required a great deal of coordination and centralization, basically management. And part of the story of the early 20th century is sort of the corporate turn and corporate development and the development of organizational structures in economic life. Well, that same sort of organizational management impulse spilled over into the Catholic world as well. In 1919, Cardinal Patrick Hayes established a centralized office for Catholic charities in the Archdiocese of New York to place the more than 200 separate health and social welfare agencies in the Archdiocese under one umbrella. His actions came in response to the charity fight of the 1910s. In 1916, the New York State established a commission to investigate charities that received public funds. And that action forced Catholic institutions and agencies to get their internal affairs in order to meet state standards. And here I should note that even though Cardinal Hayes is often regarded as the, quote, father of Catholic charities in New York, yes, he established the office, but it was largely women religious who founded, staffed, and managed the institutions and carried out this charitable work. The same centralization impulse that took place in charitable work also spilled over into education. Sisters took the lead in centralizing educational activity. In the Diocese of Brooklyn, the Amityville Dominicans and the Sisters of St. Joseph in Brentwood, the two largest teaching orders in the diocese, worked with diocesan officials to coordinate Catholic education and forge parochial schools into a school system. They worked with diocesan officials to raise standards and improve instruction. As historian James T. Carroll has discussed, by 1920, many of the larger dioceses in the country, New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, had put in place school superintendents, usually priests, who were responsible for coordinating educational matters in the diocese. As Carroll writes, quote, "These men were responsible for planning and coordinating the expansion of schools, establishing policies and procedures, developing curriculum and instructional material, liaising with state officials, overseeing finances, and negotiating with religious orders on matters of staffing. The superintendents were frequently assisted by community supervisors from those religious orders, who were akin to assistant superintendents, who represented individual religious communities and monitored the schools that they operated. These community supervisors proved incredibly influential. Among their notable contributions, they worked to develop a handbook that laid out uniform curriculum and a uniform school calendar. They set competencies for evaluating teacher effectiveness and collaborated with diocesan officials on the, quote, rational expansion of Catholic schools as new residential districts developed in Queens, South Brooklyn, and Nassau and Suffolk counties. This was before Long Island was spun off for the Diocese of Rockville Centre in 1957. The standardized curriculum helped ensure that students received the same level of instruction across the system. It also helped teaching sisters as well. It allowed communities to move sisters between schools, knowing that a reassigned sister would be able to carry existing lesson plans into her new institution. Third grade was the third grade no matter where she was teaching. I think we need to know even more about how this Catholic institutional world operated. So we see in the early 20th century, not just a world of brick and mortar institutions, but the development of systems and the value of these Catholic institutional systems and networks. They were incredibly rich, incredibly influential, and to some extent, largely understudied. Moving ahead, this world, in some ways, is a thing of the past. I think we're all very much aware that we've entered an era not of brick and mortar growth, but of institutional decline, with parishes and schools closing and the seeming unraveling of a dense Catholic institutional system that nurtured Catholic life in past generations. The first wave of parish closures hit major dioceses starting in the 1980s. Chicago and Detroit were among the first to implement comprehensive parochial restructuring, and it's now become a reality in virtually every diocese. And even there, when places like Detroit implemented those parish restructuring plans in the 1980s, even they admitted that it was something that should have been done even earlier on. But in a place like Detroit, they were reluctant to close parishes in the 1960s and 70s because those were anchors of a community of communities that had been ravaged by kind of the urban violence and riots of the 1960s. And the Catholic Church had made a commitment to keeping those parishes alive. The glories of the past became a burden for the present. Dioceses could no longer afford to subsidize inner-city parishes, often with large physical plants that required enormous upkeep. Elementary and secondary schools that had been built or expanded in the 1950s and 1960s to accommodate the baby boom generation, now stood half empty as the demographic bubble burst. Many dioceses and religious orders have shifted from strategies of growth to managed decline. So perhaps we've reached an end of an era, but I don't want to end this with just lament. I hope that we can take some other lessons from all of this with us. As a way of thinking about some of these lessons, let me offer just a few. First, I think it's really important that we convey the value of these institutions. And it can be hard to convey the importance of institutions, especially for a younger generation who might be spiritual but not religious, or to those who have lost trust in institutional religion because of the abuses or scandals of the past. But institutions mattered. They were a home and a haven. They were and are a means for living out Catholic values and manifesting religious commitments. They demonstrate the power of collective action, and they offer a platform for public engagement. I think about how institutions gave Catholics unique moral authority in public policy debates on account of their direct experience. They demonstrate the power of collective action. In the run-up to the passage of the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, one of the key advocates for reform was Sister Carol Keehan, a member of the Daughters of Charity and the head of the Catholic Health Association. She spoke not as a pundit or as a technocrat, but as a practitioner. She began her career at Providence Hospital in Washington, D.C., working her way from nursing to administration. She knew the need for healthcare reform because she witnessed the effects of healthcare inequalities firsthand. She was able to tap those experiences to make a case among political leaders for the moral and economic necessity of reform. And she spoke with the might of the Catholic Health Association behind her. I also think about institutional history as a tool for mission. We need to appreciate all that parishes, schools, hospitals, and other institutions contributed to Catholic life and wider society. Historians have been working to tell the story, but institutions can do the same. Institutional histories can sometimes be devalued as uncritical, celebratory accounts, but they have a distinct purpose and value. In researching St. Vincent's, I was struck by how often the hospital told its own story, not just in anniversary volumes, but in newsletters, brochures, fundraising materials, and the like. Any opportunity that they could use to tell the history of St. Vincent's, they did. It was a way of connecting doctors, nurses, staff, and the public with the mission of the institution. It instilled in them a sense of belonging and purpose. It helped them understand their work as part of a longer tradition. It made them part of the story. Every institution should appreciate its history and see its own history as a tool for ongoing mission today. On the more recent story of institutional decline, how do we come to terms with that story? It's both a challenge and an opportunity. Brick and mortar Catholicism drew strength from its solid structural foundations. But one thing that it did not account for was mobility. Institutions remain rooted. Catholics themselves did not. And this was not new. Institutions designed in earlier era were designed to stand the test of time, even when evidence suggested that Catholic life was much more fluid. Speaking at the cornerstone dedication of the new parish in West Philadelphia in 1922, Philadelphia's Cardinal Doherty remarked how during the joy of that occasion, his thoughts turned to, quote, those fine old parishes in other districts of the city whose lifeblood is being given to support these new ventures. Many of those older immigrant era parishes survived only because new immigrant groups moved in to fill the pews left empty by those departing for newer residential districts and were building up that church in the 1920s. So the story of mobility isn't just new to us in the late 20th and early 21st century. It was kind of baked into the brick and mortar experience going back to the 1920s. So how do we make our institutions perhaps more adept at responding to the mobility of the Catholic population? And then finally, how can we leverage these institutional structures to serve current needs? And here, women religious have been at the forefront of some of these plans to reuse church buildings and properties. The Sisters of St. Joseph in the Diocese of Orange in Southern California converted their mother house into senior housing in cooperation with Mercy Housing Corporation. The Sisters of Charity of New York have established a housing development corporation of their own to build senior and low-income housing on property that they own. DePaul, USA has used convents and other facilities for both temporary housing and permanent supportive housing to aid the poor, immigrants and refugees, and most recently, college students facing housing insecurity. And several religious communities have placed their property in land trusts as an act of environmental stewardship. And here I'll call attention to the Sisters of St. Joseph of Brentwood as being among them. In 2023, they committed to donating a forested 47-acre parcel of their mother house to a land alliance. Earlier, they worked to preserve another 20-acre portion by returning it to agricultural use. So I'll end with kind of that thought of sort of hopefulness on how all of this brick and mortar inheritance of the past can be reused to serve purposes today, to respond to new needs. And so in this way, the institutional legacy of the past continues to live on. So thank you, and I look forward to and discussion.
Thanks, Tom. I think you, in the Q&A box, you have already a comment. Despite anti-Catholic propaganda and defamation in the 19th century, there must have been real instances of abuse in Catholic institutions. Were abuse cases ever dealt with within the Catholic Church or in the general public?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I'm trying to think of cases where kind of abuse would have made it to sort of a criminal trial, and off the top of my head, I can't. But it's also sort of how we think about what constitutes abuse and how that would have been treated in the legal system in the past. One historian, sort of Leslie Tentler at the Catholic University of America, many years ago, she started writing a history of the diocesan priesthood. And for various reasons, sort of the project stalled. But she recently admitted, kind of in the wake of the sex abuse crisis, that it was hard for her to return to that project because she didn't know how to read some of those sources from the past. So when she was looking at sort of the diaries of missionary priests working in like Wisconsin or Minnesota in the 1870s or 1880s, how does she now read the story of a frontier priest who took in sort of a teenager in order to teach them sort of Latin or Greek in order to provide them with sort of pre-seminary training? You know, it was an arrangement that was incredibly common at that time to sort of take in boarders, to take in house guests. But how do we read that now in light of all that we know?
Right.
You know, some of these things of abuse, going back, it's also hard to sort of pull out the truth from all of the sensationalized accounts that are there. And certainly looking back, many of these charges would have been from sort of nativist or Protestant critics who called attention to sort of the abuses. And here, I think kind of the issue for many of these kind of Catholic institutions, it's less about sort of direct sexual abuse. It's more how standards of, say, childcare have changed and how we would look at sort of how Catholic orphanages were run, you know, that sort of these children were sort of, I want to give the sisters sort of full credit for doing their best to care for these children, but at times they're overwhelmed. And what do you do when sort of disease breaks out within an institution? You know, how were those things managed? How was sort of poor behavior managed? And so, you know, kind of there's those sorts of questions. There's also kind of a way that kind of these Catholic institutions created entanglements for Catholic sisters or the Catholic Church. Some of these, not just sort of orphanages, but kind of other child care institutions, were basically part of what we might call sort of kind of a juvenile care system, where sort of truants or young women, fallen women, would be placed under the care of Catholic sisters. And there's one historian at St. Louis University who's doing work on kind of some of these childcare institutions in San Francisco, kind of the equivalent of like Magdalene laundries, where kind of groups like the Sisters of the Good Shepherd established these homes for fallen women, for young women. And often those women were placed to them by the juvenile courts or state institutions. So to some extent, to what extent are these Catholic institutions sort of complicit in that kind of sort of youth placement system? So, you know, kind of I kind of went a little bit off topic from the question, but it made me think about how complex it is to think about sort of the standards of abuse, today's standards, when you apply them to the past.
Mm. Professor Preuss, I think, has this comment. He said, not to put a negative spin, but in 1904, the New York Foundling Hospital sent about 40 orphans west on Charles Loring Brace's orphan trains. The priest in Arizona arranged for Mexican-American families to adopt them, but this caused a controversy, and whites abducted the children to save them. So nativism is undermining the efforts. Also wanted to bring up the Knights of Columbus was established as part of the effort to stem anti-Catholicism and also against the prohibition of Catholic men from joining, you know what, the Masonic order.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so there are two parts to that question, and I thank Dr. Preuss for that, for those comments. He's absolutely right that the part of what the founding did was kind of in competition to Protestant child-saving organizations, and the most prominent was Charles Loring Brace's Children Aid Society. They wanted to place sort of children from New York, send them out to sort of farming communities and things like that, but often severing parental rights. And so the Catholics were insistent that sort of the faith of the child and parental rights should always be maintained whenever possible. And so there was this instance of Catholics joining these orphan trains, and there's a great book on the topic, The Great Arizona Orphan Abduction by Linda Gordon. It's phenomenal. She writes as sort of a legal historian. And so when these Catholic orphans were sent out from New York, the sisters wanted to make sure that the faith of the child was established. And working with local priests in Arizona, the Catholic families there were Mexican American. And this outraged the local Anglo population, who saw these white children from New York being placed with dark-skinned families. And of course, this is funny because these white children in New York were not necessarily considered white. They were sort of Irish Catholic. They were often kind of in the sort of nativist anti-immigrant hostility. Kind of the Irish were considered an inferior race. So, you know, kind of these children gained kind of this white status when they arrived in Arizona. And the Anglo family started sort of abducting these children. And it led to it was vigilante justice, but it led to kind of a case that worked its way all the way up to the Supreme Court over that. The other part of that comment was the Knights of Columbus. So at the same time as groups like the Holy Name Society are growing, the Knights of Columbus too. And this allows for the mobilization of Catholic activity. The Knights of Columbus were incredibly important in the Catholic response to World War I, to helping sort of ensure that the religious needs of soldiers were met, to make sure that the groups like the YMCA didn't have a monopoly on kind of the pastoral care of soldiers. And so in some ways, it reflects sort of this sort of Catholic institutional subculture, but it also reflects that defensiveness. Why were all these Catholic organizations founded? Because Catholics were often forbidden from joining sort of other organizations like the YMCA. Even those that might seem non-sectarian were considered Protestant and therefore a threat to kind of Catholic spiritual health. So of course, the response is for Catholics to form their own parallel organizations of everything that Protestants or secular society was doing. And some of these institutions continue to exist, but others they met their need and then kind of collapsed because they were no longer as necessary. Those boundaries between the Catholic world and the secular world started to fade, not just because of Vatican II, but other cultural forces. And that's part of what we're going to talk about next week when we talk about what I'm calling mid-century modern, kind of the mid-century, mid-20th century Catholicism.
But Tom, I'd like to ask a question here, and others, if you want to ask a question, please put your hand up. One of the things you talked about when you talked about it was the dense social network. That was the language that you used. And I guess, yeah, there may be other societies now that other people can go to, but I mean, where do people who, think about the Rosary societies, the Columbiettes, the altar cloth society, stuff like that. I mean, you. I guess I'm asking this question because in a lot of religious congregations now, you are seeing this phenomenon known as associates, right? Women who are associating with religious communities, not to become nuns, but to have an opportunity for prayer, for society, really, with other people who think the same way, or act the same way, or seeking the same thing. I mean, it, I'm wondering, do you think that some of that growth of associations, especially associations of women associating with religious communities, is beginning to, or has begun to develop precisely because parishes no longer offer opportunities for people to join together in societies and come out of your house and do something, is that, what do you think? I mean, do you notice this growth of associations, and you wonder why? I mean, we do in religious life. All of these people now, you know, 60 years ago they weren't there, but now they're there. And I always try to look for an explanation for why we have this now and we didn't have it 60 years ago. So I'd like your 2 cents on that.
Yeah, well, I mean, who am I to sort of challenge you on interpretations of
Oh,
those
no, not
associate programs? But I mean, I think it was sort of some of those associate programs were, from my understanding, developed in part to help religious communities carry on their charism, often bringing in women who kind of had been educated by the sisters or kind of involved in their ministries of healthcare and things like that, as a way of kind of continuing that good work in a way that previously that was up to the sisters to do. And now it's sort of opening up to say, no, this is all about lay responsibility. You too can join us. But putting aside those associate programs, which I think are sort of a kind of more of a kind of a late 20th century phenomenon, I think this rich institutional subculture really speaks to the power of community. And sort of one of the arguments to be made about organized religion and institutions is that they provide community. And it's something we crave as we sort of stand behind screens, as we're sort of in our own little sort of tech bubbles. And so, kind of these may be small initiatives, but you see the power of things like kind of volunteerism. You have young adults who join things like sort of the Jesuit Volunteer Corps and are ruined for life, as they say. Sort of efforts on the parish level to rebuild organizations, whether sort of young adult groups, teen groups, Bible studies. That these outlets still exist, and that's what the institution can offer, sort of that place of gathering, that sense of belonging. And I think sort of a lot of ministry today has really tried to emphasize the importance of community, not necessarily religious community in terms of vowed religious, but just community bonds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess I mean I agree with you. People are looking for community, but as we're speaking, you see more and more dioceses closing schools, closing closing the kind of institutions and avenues of community, and also for lack of priesthood. I was saying at a
Mhm,
meeting today, just here in the Diocese of Brooklyn, and other people can probably speak as well. You know, um, the lack of priests has meant even recent announcement that there wouldn't be Saturday evening vigil mass anymore, and masses have to be reduced on Sunday. So I
mhm,
guess j- at, I mean, I think what you pointed out today is how important the institutions were, and we have to. What do we do to keep that institutional structure um, intact? Because it's so important to keep the rest of it. It's like the trunk of the tree. If you remove the trunk of the tree, where do you go from there?
mhm. And I'm also sort of moral witness. This enables the Catholic Church to speak publicly, Catholic Church, diocese, religious orders to speak publicly on these issues because they're there, they're in the front lines, they're witnessing these things. I'm sort of thinking about sort of kind of Catholic charities on the Mexican border. Catholic bishops and sisters like Norma Pimentel are able to speak to those issues because they're there, they're witnessing all of this. And so that kind of gets lost. And sort of I mourn the loss of all of these sort of schools, parishes, and kind of the story of sort of constant decline. Just before this session, I was scrolling through Facebook and sort of announcement in Brooklyn, the closing of Our Lady of Perpetual Help.
Right.
Kind of one of these Catholic schools that had previously sort of served sort of 12,000 students at a time, not 12,000, 1,200 students at a time, now is an enrollment that shrunk to below 100, and so you simply can't sustain that network. So in some ways, consolidation is inevitable, but the parishes sort of, I worry that there's only so much that you can cut if you're making decisions solely on the availability of priests, because these work sort of you still need those institutions to bring people together.
Mhm.
So yeah, kind of there's certainly a richness to all of this. And as a side story, as much as those of us in the Northeast talk about retrenchment, there are other places in the United States where the Catholic Church is growing.
Right.
Sort of the American South, the American Southwest, um, Texas, California, new parishes are still being established. So it's not all doom and gloom. But it's just kind of again adjusting to the mobility and kind of the centers of Catholic population of the 1920s are not the centers of Catholic population today.
Hmm. And do you think that uh, one one factor in this as well is that in, say, the Northeast, where we always depended on large classes of seminarians, we really never, after Vatican II, really trained the laity to assume the roles that they could be taking in the Catholic Church? I mean, do you see any of that?
Um, some of it, but I think, there certainly was sort of a lay resurgence in helping to maintain these institutions, school teachers or Catholic nurses. But I think
Mhm.
part of the problem too was, whether the expectation that those Catholic lay teachers or those Catholic nurses would be willing to make the same sacrifices as women religious in terms of lower salaries, longer working hours, just sort of always going above and beyond what was required of them. And sort of that has been another part of this piece, that kind of the human capital that these institutions relied on, vowed
Right.
religious, but also kind of committed lay people, that becomes harder to find in the same number. And again, sort of some of this still continues, sort of young people who are committed to sort of things like Cristo Rey schools and are willing to give uh, sort of uh, sort of time and energy to those ventures. But it's often sort of shorter term as opposed to lifelong commitments. Somebody who's going to give sort of a year or two out of college or an early professional moment to kind of these ministries. It becomes harder to sustain that as a lifelong commitment at times.
Mhm.
Yeah, and so that's kind of a whole separate story. When I was talking, I focused on some of the economic capital that was needed to sustain these institutions. But you're absolutely right. The other part of the story is the human capital that made this entire Catholic institutional network possible, and also became self-replicating. You know, these institutions then became sort of the seedbeds for vocations that would then help maintain kind of the further expansion.
Anyone else
I
out
see a
there?
third question. Oh, kind of Jean just sort of said, great question, sister, there, kind of the third comment. But yeah, we welcome people who may want to raise your hand, and we can have you sort of jump in by speaking your comment as well.
Matthew, can you see anybody's hand up? Because I'm just seeing Tom. Matthew's there somewhere.
Sorry, I don't see any hands in the audience at this time.
Okay. Any other questions? Well, I think a lot of people who were on the screen tonight are people who've lived much of the experience of brick and mortar church building. As Tom was talking, you think about all the parishes. I was especially struck by what he said about, financial campaigns to get things going. I think many of us remember being in our dining room tables when somebody from the parish came, and everybody had a pledge, and we built the diocesan high schools in this diocese, as I'm sure took place in other dioceses around the country. So, I mean, we're trying our best, I think, as we age, hopefully gracefully, to do what we can to ensure the continuation of these institutions. They're the lifeblood of the church. And so maybe tonight, as we conclude, we can not simply pray for vocations, but pray that the work that has begun and all of the good that has come through the institutions of the Catholic Church can some way, shape, or form continue, some way, shape, or form. It may not be as it was before. It may not be with the people that was before. It may not be in the forms that we had before, but certainly the life of the church has to continue in some way. And I think tonight, as we close, we remember that our Holy Father did a beautiful thing today, reminding the American bishops of the importance of the dignity of every human person and care for ignorance, the immigrants, care for the immigrants, as are all exposed to the political rhetoric these days, which is violent and so diminishing of other human beings. So hooray, Pope Francis, send more letters if need be. And again, remember tonight the poor people of Gaza and Israel and all the suffering of the world, that God will bring an end to conflict and enlighten and ennoble world leaders to do the right thing and to bring the peace that God wishes for all of creation. So thank you, Tom. It was a great night again. Thank you, everybody, for joining. It's 8:15. God bless. See you all next week. Bye now. Bye, Tom.